Harlem did not choose chaos. It learned to live with it. Long before headlines spoke of crime, before cameras arrived to explain what went wrong, there was a quiet truth moving through the streets. When trouble came, the law did not always come with it. And when the law did arrive, it often came late or confused or looking in the wrong direction. In that gap, something else began to grow. Not justice, not peace, but a kind of order that did not wear a uniform. People did not talk about it openly. They simply learned who to trust. And for many in Harlem, that trust did not belong to the law. Before anyone feared the name, before stories traveled beyond a neighborhood, there was a man whose presence seemed to slow the world around him. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Most people would later know him as Bumpy. But long before that name meant anything, he was simply a boy growing up in a country that did not promise protection to everyone. He was born into a world where rules were clear, but fairness was not. In the American South, authority existed, but it did not serve all people equally. As a child, Ellsworth watched adults lower their voices, step aside, and accept limits they never agreed to. He learned early that the law could stand right in front of you and still refuse to see you. That lesson became real when his older brother was killed after a confrontation with a white man. The system responded with silence. No trial brought balance. No punishment brought closure. Nothing came back to make sense of the loss. For a young mind, this moment did not create rage. It created understanding. If protection was not guaranteed, then survival depended on something else. Not hope, not waiting, but replacement. That belief did not make Ellsworth violent. It made him observant. He began to notice how power actually worked. Not how it was supposed to work, but how it moved in real life. When he was sent north to Harlem, the move was not about opportunity. It was about escape. Harlem was alive in a way few places were. Music flowed through open windows. People spoke with confidence. Culture had room to breathe. But beneath that surface was pressure. Too many people, too few jobs, too many promises broken by systems that never adjusted. Police were present, but trust was missing. When problems appeared, people handled them themselves. Not because they wanted to, but because they had learned to. Ellsworth did not arrive as a leader. He arrived as a listener. He left school early, but he read constantly. He read history to understand patterns. He read poetry to understand silence. He read about men who ruled without titles and societies that survived without. And one of its most visible figures was a woman who refused to remain invisible. Stéphanie St. Clair. Educated, outspoken, unwilling to surrender Harlem's economy to outside forces. She understood something the authorities did not. Control does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from legitimacy. She recognized that Johnson possessed discipline without recklessness, and she brought him close, learning how power actually works. Johnson did not become a symbol overnight. Under St. Clair's influence, he learned the mechanics of informal authority, when to intervene, when to wait, when presence alone was enough. He learned that violence was a tool, not a language. And most importantly, he learned that predictability creates stability. These lessons would define his rise. The numbers war when Harlem was contested. Harlem's economy attracted attention, not curiosity, but ambition. Dutch Schultz, a white gangster from outside the neighborhood, sought control of the numbers trade. He did not want partnership. He wanted domination. The conflict that followed was not subtle. Intimidation, shootings, sudden disappearances. But this was not merely a business dispute. It was about who had the right to govern Harlem's survival. While Schultz relied on overwhelming force, Johnson relied on precision, calculated retaliation, information, timing. When Dutch Schultz was assassinated in 1935, the war ended, but its consequences did not. What Johnson could not see yet was how closely his name was now being watched. That stability came from people who understood limits. Stephanie St. Clair was one of them. She believed that survival required more than force. It required trust. Ellsworth became part of that system not because he was loud or cruel, but because he was reliable. He did not overreact. He did not seek attention. He handled matters quietly, and left space behind him. Over time, people stopped asking who was in charge. They already knew who to find. This was not hero worship. It was habit. When a dispute arose, intermediaries were sent. When someone crossed the line, consequences followed. Not instantly, but surely. The law could not promise that. This system could. Trust grew not because Ellsworth was kind, but because he was predictable. In environments shaped by uncertainty, predictability becomes safety. People feared him, but they also understood him. And understanding reduces chaos. The moment everything changed came when outsiders noticed Harlem's money. They saw profit, not balance. They brought force without context. They did not care about the fragile order that already existed. This forced a decision that could not be avoided. Ellsworth could step aside and let chaos return, or he could enforce the rules himself. He chose enforcement. That choice marked the point of no return. Violence followed, but it was controlled. It had purpose. Harlem watched as boundaries were defended and lines were redrawn. The message was clear. Disorder would not be tolerated, not by the police, but by something closer. Public reaction was quiet. There were no marches, no speeches, just behavior changes. People stopped calling the police. They stopped waiting. They adjusted. Media from outside the neighborhood often misunderstood what they saw. They reported crime. Harlem experienced order. But power that works too well becomes visible. Federal attention grew slowly. Files thickened. Patterns were noted. Money moved too smoothly. Violence appeared too selective. Someone was holding the system together. Ellsworth felt the pressure, but he did not retreat. By then, the structure depended on him. Removing himself would collapse it. Staying mid-exposure. There was no safe choice left. This was only the beginning. Harlem had placed its trust. The state was beginning to respond. And once that process started, it would not stop. The question that remained unanswered was simple and dangerous. When a law does not protect you, who do you replace it with? And what happens when that replacement becomes stronger than the law itself? That question would follow Harlem for decades. And it would follow one man to the very end. Power rarely collapses all at once. It weakens slowly, like a structure exposed to weather it was never built to survive. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Harlem's informal order had become visible. Too visible. What once operated quietly now left patterns. Money moved in predictable ways. Disputes ended with unusual speed. Violence appeared, but only when rules were broken. To the people living there, this meant stability. To the state, it meant control without permission. Federal authorities did not rush in. They never do. They watched. They listened. They compared notes over years, not weeks. Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood problem. It had become a case study. Investigators began to ask a dangerous question. Who keeps order when the law is not trusted? And how long can that last before it becomes a threat to the state itself? At the center of those questions was Bumpy Johnson. By now, his name carried weight far beyond the streets where it was first whispered. He was not loud. He did not give speeches. He did not seek attention. But his presence was felt in the absence of chaos. That absence was the problem. The government understood something the public did not. Systems do not need violence to be powerful. They need consistency. Harlem's informal system had that. And Johnson was seen as one of the people who kept it functioning. Not as a symbol, but as a mechanism. The shift from local tolerance to federal concern did not happen overnight. For years, gambling had been quietly ignored. The numbers game was illegal, but it was treated as manageable. Narcotics were different. They crossed borders. They attracted national attention. They demanded response. As the drug trade expanded after the war, federal priorities changed. Harlem became part of a larger map. Routes, suppliers, distributors. No longer a closed system. Prosecutors later alleged that Johnson played a coordinating role within this world, not as its creator, not as its sole controller, but as someone who maintained balance. In criminal networks, balance is influence, and influence becomes evidence. Johnson sensed the shift long before arrest came. Meetings became shorter. Conversations grew quieter. Trust narrowed. He knew what attention meant. He had seen it before. But stepping away was no longer possible. The system he helped shape depended on his presence. Removing himself would invite chaos. Staying meant exposure. The choice was already made. Federal investigators waited. They gathered testimony. They documented relationships. They watched patterns repeat. This was not about catching someone in the act. It was about proving structure. Conspiracy laws were designed for moments like this. They did not require direct action. They required connection. When the indictment finally came in the early 1950s, it was precise, calculated. Johnson did not resist. He did not disappear. He appeared in court calmly. This was not surrender. It was recognition. He understood the nature of the charge. This was not a street fight. This was a dismantling. The courtroom did not care about reputation. It did not care about community memory. It cared about documents. Witnesses testified. Some were reliable. Some were compromised. But together, they created a picture the court accepted. Association became guilt. Presence became participation. The conviction removed Johnson from Harlem physically, but not immediately psychologically. 15 years in federal prison erased territory, not memory. Inside, the world shrank. There were no negotiations, no intermediaries, no structure he controlled. Prison does not destroy power instantly. It strips it layer by layer. Johnson adapted. He read. He wrote. He observed. Violence existed around him, but he avoided becoming part of it. Survival required restraint. Outside, Harlem adjusted. New figures rose. New rules formed. Some respected the old balance. Others did not. The longer Johnson stayed away, the less central he became. Time is the most effective weapon against informal power. Absence breakable. People find new solutions. Old names lose urgency. Johnson was not betrayed. He was replaced by circumstance. Years passed. Letters carried fragments of information. Visits brought incomplete pictures. Decisions were made without him. Every decision weakened his relevance. Power decays when it cannot respond. When he was released in the early 1960s, Harlem was no longer the place he left. The pace had changed. The violence was less controlled. Drugs were more visible. The quiet order that once defined the neighborhood had eroded. Johnson returned not as a ruler, but as a symbol of an earlier time. Respect remained, but was no longer absolute. People listened, but they did not wait. The system had learned to operate without him. Federal attention did not disappear. It shifted. He was observed not because he dominated, but because he represented continuity, a living link to a system the state believed it had already broken. Johnson's health declined. Years of vigilance, confinement, and pressure accumulated quietly. Doctors warned him, but caution had never guided his life. He had always lived inside tension. Now, tension lived inside him. Another investigation began to form. Incomplete, unfinished, but real. Johnson knew. He waited. He had waited before. Waiting had become part of the pattern. This phase was not defined by gunfire or betrayal. It was defined by erosion. Influence slipping away without a fight. Power fading without collapse. Harlem moved forward. The state remained patient. The balance that once made Johnson necessary no longer existed. What replaced it was louder, faster, and less restrained. The community paid a different price now. The order they once trusted had dissolved, and the law had not yet filled the gap. This was the middle of the story, not the end. The man remained. The myth lingered. But the system that made him trusted was already gone. What followed would not be dramatic. It would be quiet, and that quiet would say more than any confrontation ever could. When power fades, it does not disappear loudly. It becomes quiet, almost polite. By the mid-1960s, Harlem no longer moved around one man. The streets were still familiar, the buildings unchanged, but the rhythm was different. The balance that once held everything together had already broken. What remained was memory, and memory is not the same as control. When Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem after years away, he did not announce himself. There was no moment of return, no signal to the neighborhood. He walked the same streets, entered the same small restaurants, and sat among people who remembered him. But remembrance is softer than loyalty. It does not demand action. It only recognizes the past. Harlem had learned to move without him. During his absence, new figures had risen. Some were careful, many were not. The rules that once slowed violence had weakened. Disputes no longer waited for permission. Drugs moved openly. Fear spread faster than order. What had once been controlled chaos became unpredictable noise. Johnson saw this clearly. He did not try to reclaim what time had taken. He did not challenge younger men who no longer understood patience. He listened. He watched. He understood something that few people ever accept. Power that depends on presence cannot survive absence. And he had been absent too long. People still spoke to him with respect. They lowered their voices. They remembered how things used to be. But they did not stop and wait for his approval. Decisions were made without him. Conflicts resolved themselves, often badly. Johnson was no longer the center. He was a reminder. Federal attention never fully left him. It changed shape. He was watched not because he controlled Harlem, but because he represented a system the state believed it had already defeated. He was a symbol of informal power, and symbols are never fully ignored. He answered questions calmly. He had learned how to do that long ago. He understood that resistance now would change nothing. The state no longer needed urgency. Time was already working in its favor. His health declined slowly. Years of pressure, prison, and vigilance had consequences. His heart weakened. Doctors warned him, but warnings had never shaped his life. He had lived with risk so long that it felt normal. Stillness was unfamiliar. Rest felt unnatural. By the late 1960s, another federal case was forming. It was incomplete but real. Johnson knew. Once again, he waited. Waiting had become part of his identity. It was how he survived long enough to see power leave him behind. The final day did not feel important. There was no sign that it would be remembered. On a warm summer evening, Johnson entered a familiar restaurant in Harlem. He sat down alone. He ordered coffee. There was no tension in the room, no argument, no threat. People noticed him, but no one reacted. Then it ended. There was no violence, no last words, no final confrontation. His heart failed quietly. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson died seated upright, as if refusing to fall even at the end. News traveled quickly, but without shock. Harlem did not explode. There was no scramble for control, no sudden sift. The neighborhood absorbed the absence as it had absorbed many others. Life continued. It always had. He was buried among people who lived very different lives. Politicians, artists, businessmen. The distance between them mattered less in death than it had in life. He had always existed between worlds. Now he remained there permanently. What followed was not silence, but story. Memory began to change shape. Details softened. Motives became simpler. Popular culture stepped in where records stopped. The man became a character. The character became a legend. In stories, he was decisive. In reality, he was cautious. In stories, he ruled absolutely. In reality, he negotiated constantly. In stories, he protected everyone. In reality, protection always had a cost. Myth is easier than truth. Myth does not need documents. It does not need balance. It only needs emotion. Harlem's memory held both gratitude and fear. Those emotions blended into something that felt like respect. But records tell a harder story. They describe a man who did not fix injustice, but learned to operate inside it. He did not remove violence. He controlled it. He did not create peace. He created predictability. For some, that predictability felt like safety. For others, it felt like pressure. Victims rarely appear in legends. They remain unnamed, unremembered. Their absence is part of the cost. Johnson's life raises an uncomfortable question. When the law fails to protect, is informal power inevitable? Or is it a temporary solution that creates new harm over time? Harlem answered that question once. They chose order over uncertainty, speed over delay, familiar faces over distant authority. That choice made sense in the moment. But time does not judge decisions by intention. It judges them by outcome. When a system that replaced the law disappeared, the law did not immediately return stronger. Something else filled the space. Louder, faster, less restrained. The cost changed but did not disappear. This is why the story remains important. Not because one man was powerful, but because so many people trusted him. Not because he was feared, but because he was reliable when nothing else was. Power built outside the law always believes it is temporary. It tells itself it exists only until things improve. But improvement rarely arrives on schedule. Temporary systems become permanent, and permanence attracts attention. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson did not set out to become a symbol. He responded to absence. He filled a gap. Others followed because the gap was real. In the end, the man faded before the myth. The system faded before the story. What remains is a question that still echoes in places where trust is thin. When protection fails, who do people turn to? And what happens when that trust costs more than it gives? Power does not disappear when a man dies. It moves. It changes shape. It waits for the next silence. And silence always returns.